All right, now let's move on to the second New Deal. The first New Deal lasted from 1933 to 1934. By 1935, his programs were so popular that Congress allowed him to start a second New Deal. This part focused more on the relief and the reform side of things. Harry Hopkins would become even more involved in these programs. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, actually sent billions between 1935 to 1940 to employ millions of people who had been on relief rolls of state and local governments. Now, most of these people were hired to construct, new bridges, roads, even airports, public buildings. But this is the big one I want you to know with the WPA. Unemployed artists were actually paid to paint murals and to write and even perform plays. Excuse me. Were able to write and perform in plays, locally. What they would do is they would have people put on like The Sound of Music or Annie or something like that for local people, and it would be able to get them out of the house and would allow them to go see, just have something to do, and it would pay people to paint these large murals on the sides of buildings to kind of improve their hometowns and to just kind of get artists back to work, which was nice as well. The National Labor Relations, or the Wagner Act, this replaced the labor provisions of the National Industry Recovery Act after it was declared unconstitutional. It guaranteed a worker's right to join a union and a union's right to collectively bargain. It outlawed business practices that were unfair to labor, and it also created the National Labor Relations Board that was empowered to enforce the law and to make sure that the workers' rights were being protected. And as they did this, it pretty much kind of tried to help workers again and work relations with their bosses. In the second New Deal, taxes increased the income. They increased the tax on incomes on the wealthy class, but the younger class, the more moderate incomes to the poor incomes were not as affected through this. Another big thing of this next one, excuse me, was the Social Security Act, and that was created in 1935. The federal insurance program based upon the collection of payments from employees and employers throughout people's working careers. The fund would then be used to make monthly payments to retired people over the age of 65. And those people who lost jobs, people who are disabled, dependents, also had the opportunity to be covered. We still use this, and a variety of modifications have taken place, but this was the first time that they decided to actually try this and see if it would work. And they were very pleased with how this worked, mainly because people didn't live that long. People didn't live much past the age of 65, so they weren't really getting a ton of this money in the meantime. But the whole idea of this program is to try to allow people to be able to get some work or get money from work that from their careers, I guess. But it allows them to get that later on when they need it. So it kind of like holds it. It's like the government kind of acts as like a banker for a fund that you have to put money into. And they take it right out of your paycheck. The election of 1936, the economy was improving, but was still weak and unstable. Many people were encouraged by FDR's proactive style. Farmers and workers were really the ones that were benefiting here. But businesses weren't a huge fan because of his regulations that stemmed from measures such as the Wagner Act. From the Wagner Act, Republicans chose Alfred Landon from Kansas. He didn't really like how much was being spent, but wasn't a huge adversary of the New Deal. Really, at this stage in the game, the Republicans are just throwing out somebody and hoping for the best. The Democrats, Franklin Roosevelt, still really popular and still spoke of more positive changes that he was going to be making. Result, FDR is going to win every state except for Maine and Vermont. And from here until the 1960s, the Democrats would rely on white ethnic groups in the cities, Midwestern farmers, and labor unions. They could rely also on the votes of African Americans who left African Americans in northern cities who left the Republican Party because of the benefits of FDR and the New Deal. The opponents of the New Deal, liberals, especially during the first few years of the New Deal, liberals were critical that it did little for the unemployed and for the working class. They didn't like that the president did little to address the issues of minorities, specifically ethnics and women and the elderly. Eventually, he is going to address some of that, but the liberals, for the most part, try to stay close to him. Conservatives, way more critical of Franklin Roosevelt and his policies, charging that they were borderline socialistic and communistic, which you could make an argument for the socialistic side of things. They didn't like the deficit financing, that's financing government programs on borrowed money. Many business leaders didn't like the added regulations and pro-union stance on things. Conservative Democrats joined with Republicans to create the American Liberty League. Its purpose was to stop the New Deal from destabilizing the U.S. economy and the political system. Overall, conservatives, not too surprising, sorry, were not too impressed with Franklin Roosevelt. Other critics, Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest based out of Detroit, gained a lot of popularity through his weekly radio addresses in which he criticized FDR and called for changes in the economy. He grew more anti-Semitic and fascist, and in his belief system, eventually he got kicked off the radio. Francis Townsend proposed a plan for helping elderly with an income. 2% sales tax would be used to create a special fund. In that fund, every person over the age of 60 and retired would receive a $200 a month check. The idea behind it was that the money would help stimulate the economy and bring the Depression to an end. His plan influenced FDR to create Social Security. Huey Long was nicknamed the Kingfish, and he was the one FDR was most concerned about when it came to dissenters. He was a senator and proposed the idea called Share Our Wealth, in which a promised income of $5,000 for every family. The program was supposed to be paid by taxing the wealthy class, and as he kind of comes up with this idea, it seems like an okay idea if you are really into socialism, because that's the idea of sharing your wealth. But in the long run, Americans did not really like this idea from him. They thought it was a little bit too socialistic, a little bit over the top, and again, especially if you're a part of the wealthy class, and then again, guaranteeing a $5,000 income for every family. Huey Long would announce that he would try to run for president, however, he would be assassinated later on in the year. He had some corruption issues, and as a result, probably eventually that stuff caught up with him. The Supreme Court, most of the court was filled with conservative judges who kept telling Franklin Roosevelt that his programs were not constitutional. The court organization plan, or also known as the court packing scheme. This is a bill that proposed that the president be authorized to appoint an additional justice for each current justice who was older than 70 years old, which were basically all of them. In theory, it would have allowed Franklin Roosevelt to add up to 6 more justices to the court. Those justices would have been of the liberal persuasion. Reaction was less than stellar by both Democrats and Republicans. We understand the Republican side, but the Democrats didn't really like it. This bill was shot down because of the violation of the checks and balances system. Even his own party said this was a really bad idea. During the Second New Deal, the Supreme Court did reaffirm the constitutionality of some of his programs. And because his court packing scheme never really took off, he was president for 12 years. He was able to add several justices. But again, he was trying to, create more judges that would be okay with his programs in the long run, and they just weren't having much of that. Lastly, for the unions, with the National Industrial Recovery Act and the Wagner Act being passed, it created lasting change in labor management relations by legalizing labor unions. Union membership jumped to over 10 million members. The AFL was known for being a union that would only accept skilled labor. Members within the AFL wanted to extend to all workers regardless of gender, skill, and race. John Lewis of the United Mine Workers fame helped create the Congress of Industrial Organization, that is the CIO. This group became the chief rival of the AFL because they did not accept just skilled labor. Strikes. Because many employers were breaking the law and not collectively bargaining, meaning sitting down with their employees and figuring out what to do, many workers went on strike. In 1937, GM workers in Flint, Michigan insisted on their right to join a union. As a result, they sat on the job and refused to work. Eventually, GM yielded to their demands and recognized the United Auto Workers Union. That's famous mainly because it's from us, but if you go right down Van Slyke Road, you'll see a union meeting hall, and it says home of the sit-down strikers, and that's where it took place. They literally went on the job and sat down and said, we're not going to work. The U.S. Steel Corporation agreed to accept the union, but many smaller companies did not. These strikes ended in bloodshed, particularly in Chicago. Most companies did recognize the CIO. The Fair Labor Standards Act. Seen as the last major reform in the New Deal, this created a minimum wage for 40 cents an hour and a maximum standard work week, 40 hours a week, and child labor restrictions on hiring those under 16. We still have minimum wage laws today. We also still have a standard work week, which is 40 hours, so that's the lasting impact on that. All right, that's it for this one. We'll go with the last phase of the New Deal next.